It wasn't that long ago where you'd be able to step out of the cinema after watching a Hollywood blockbuster and walk down to your local game store to pick up a copy of the video game adaptation and play through the whole story again from the comfort of your own living room. However, those times have changed, and nowadays you might get the add-on to a mobile game or a Lego game at a push. But what happened to those days of Aladdin on the Genesis and GoldenEye on the N64? Where did they go, and will we ever see them coming back? Well, to answer this, we've got to take a look back to when video games first got put in the hands of players. The year is 1975, and the film Death Race 2000 has just hit the big screen. It's a mad, action-packed racing film and was dubbed as ultra-violence, aimed at young children. Skip to a year later, and the game Death Race starts appearing in arcades. Loosely based on the idea of the film, this top-down racer would see players mowing down these humanoid gremlins to gain points. The game's violent themes drew huge controversy, but it seems to have done more than that and gave studios and game developers this spark of inspiration to start creating more of these kinds of games. Let's skip ahead 5 years, and Tron: Deadly Discs is released on Intellivision, based on the Disney sci-fi film. Although the movie gained a mixed reaction, 2 more games were created, and thus a trend seems to have started. In 1982, we saw some other big movie games released, with The Adventures of Tron, Alien, Star Wars, King Kong, and Raiders of the Lost Ark, all coming out on the Atari 2600. Now, not all of these games were a smash hit, which you would expect, but a precedent was being set. Now we hit a fairly big snag, a hard pill to swallow, and a game which became famous for all the wrong reasons. E.T. the Extraterrestrial. The game was a huge critical failure, with many blaming its rushed and sloppy development. But despite this and all the things done to remove that game from history, developers moved on, and it seems that the trend of movie games was pushing forward. It wasn't long before every big movie release had its own video game counterpart. This meant a huge number of players grew up playing games based on their favourite films of the time. Some of these games were a bit of a flop, but others, such as Disney's Aladdin on the Sega Genesis, were a huge success. In fact, Aladdin was crowned Genesis Game of the Year and is still seen as a defining game of that generation. Other studios got on board with this trend, and through the 90s we saw Star Wars games, a Blade Runner adaptation, more Indiana Jones games, and several others that didn't necessarily star Harrison Ford. But the next big milestone has to be GoldenEye 007 on the Nintendo 64. Considered one of the best games of the console and the birthplace of true couch co-op multiplayer, GoldenEye set a bar which many failed to reach. And as we break into the millennia and 3D platforming is on the rise, we start to see the developers and film studios clocking on to how profitable video game companions can be to the film. In 2002, we had full-blown games of that year's huge films, such as Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Star Wars, Spider-Man, and Monsters Inc., and even Minority Report. All of these games were generally met with praise, but none were considered at the level of Aladdin and GoldenEye, but they were still selling. Then 2005 hit, and we got 2 games which would once again stand out in history. The first is Spider-Man 2. Based on the Tobey Maguire Spidey film, this game's web-swinging mechanics paired with the great story set out by the film made for a truly great game. It's considered the best Spider-Man game for years, with only the new Spider-Man PS4 threatening to take that title. The other huge moment and a turning point for movie games was Lego Star Wars, the video game. This humble attempt to bring Lego video games to the next level, and boy did they. Most everyone these days has had an experience with a Lego game, and it's no surprise because, well, they're well made, they're fun, accessible, and they're designed to draw in a large audience. Lego games provided a formula that could be fitted to any franchise, and that's just what they did. They snapped up every franchise they could. After Star Wars, there was Indiana Jones, then Harry Potter, Pirates of the Caribbean, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, the Lego movie itself, Jurassic World, Marvel's Avengers, the Ninjago movie, and this year we had The Incredibles. However, here in 2018, apart from those Lego games, we don't seem to be getting anywhere near the number of movie tie-ins as were in the mid-2000s. So what was that turning point? Well, let's have a look at what the movies were doing at the time. In 2008, Marvel was doing something with a little film you may have heard of called Iron Man. Launching the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Iron Man was an important moment in cinema history. It started something that had never been attempted on such a scale. Following that, we had The Incredible Hulk, Iron Man 2, Thor, Captain America, and then The Avengers, with all bar the big finale film having games released alongside them. Now, these movies were huge and a massive hit with fans, so you'd expect the games to reflect that size. Sadly, that's just not what happened. All of these games were a bit of a flop, with only Captain America Super Soldier getting somewhat positive reviews. Now, it seems that Marvel cottoned onto the negative responses these games had and actually pulled the plug on an Avengers game that was in the works to be released in 2012. The game was scrapped, and so it seems were Marvel's plans for any big movie adaptations. As the MCU continued, we have seen mobile games released to the films, and eventually just additions to other popular Marvel mobile games like Contest of Champions. Now, I'm not saying that just because Marvel scrapped their games that the rest of the movie industry was following suit, but if you look at what has been released in connection with films over the past few years, we're seeing less fully fledged games and more quick mobile spin-offs. It seems that movie studios have cottoned onto the fact that movie games have never been as popular as they were in the 90s. And as a gamer, I feel that it's just because the quality isn't there. The last movie game to really get some recognition was X-Men Origins Wolverine, which was a great game adapted from a terrible movie. But the final question to ask is, where do we go from here? With games like The Last of Us becoming more like movies and the cinema experience ever changing, will we ever get to see a fully crossover into one interactive experience? It's hard to say. With VR and AR growing in popularity, only time will really tell. But I think it's safe to say we won't be seeing any more movie adaptations outside the unstoppable driving force that is the LEGO games. So I doubt we'll be seeing a Fantastic Beasts the video game or an FPS based on The Spy Who Loved Me, but maybe that's the further best. And we want to know what you think. Do you have any strong nostalgic attachment to movie games, and do you think we'll ever see an adaptation renaissance? Let us know in the comments below.